On your page. I am a child psychologist, and my particular training is in school psychology. This is a picture of me here with my family, actually at JFK Airport, as we just arrived as refugees to the US. So much of how I talk about work and working with immigrant refugee youth in schools really is part of my own story of being a refugee, of being a bilingual student, of being a first-gen student. That then has transitioned into most of my adult work and professional work focusing on supporting immigrant refugee youth in schools. The other piece that you'll hear me talk a lot about is my identity as a school-based clinician at a local high school here in Boston called Boston International Newcomers Academy, where I do a combination of direct work, but also consultation with teachers and other support staff on promoting the health and well-being of immigrant refugee youth. And I will now pass to my colleague Doris to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us today. My name is Doris Lemos, and I am a psychology student at Bunker Hill Community College, currently working at the Trauma and Community Resilience Center. I identified as a Hispanic female. I was born and raised in El Salvador and migrated to the U.S. in 2013. And my hope is to continue my education in psychology to be able to support youth and families. Now I'll pass it to my colleague, Kayla.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. My name is Kayla Majorbean Parr. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a postdoctoral psychology fellow, a trained school psychologist, and previously an educator in Boston and New York City. And I will pass it back to Vanya.
Okay, so as I shared, this training is part of a bigger initiative, a 5-part series that we are hosting here at the TCRC through our funding through SAMHSA and CTSN. We have so far done the first 2 trainings, first on migration and forced displacement, and then second training was on creating welcoming school environments. All of these trainings have been recorded. Today's training is also recorded. So in the chat now, you'll have access to those trainings if you haven't attended before, as well as our slide decks. And then today, we're particularly going to be focusing on thinking about classroom strategies for supporting immigrant refugee youth. Our format is similar every time, so we'll do some content review. We do have a special presenter today, an educator who's going to talk about their experiences of building classrooms that support immigrant refugee youth. And then we encourage you throughout the training to use the chat to either comment on something that you have found useful or helpful and or ask questions. We may not respond to the questions right away, but we'll make sure that either we do it at the end of our training and or in our follow-up after the training. So feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat. And again, the session will be recorded and all the recording and the slides and resources will be shared after our training today. Okay, so to get us started, our hope for today, we have 3 major questions that we're hoping to cover. And these questions really center on, as we said, some of us have educational background, but we are really coming at this through thinking about, social emotional supports that are needed to promote the health and well-being of immigrant refugee youth in classrooms. So the first question that we're hoping to answer is how to build classroom environments that attend to the development and learning needs of students, particularly thinking about immigrant refugee youth. How to center student experience in teaching practices and classroom curriculums. You'll hear a lot about that from Kayla as well as Kristen. And then thirdly, what are ways to attend to the diverse needs and experiences of students through collaboration with broader school community? So how do we engage families, other school providers in our buildings to promote the health and well-being of this community? To get us started, there's, as we've said in our previous trainings, there's lots of different terms that are often used when we think about immigrant refugee youth, and the term that we feel like encompasses all immigrants, all refugees, all newcomers, all unaccompanied minors is the term we call forced migration displacement. And we define that as involuntary coerced movement of a person or people away from their home or home region in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situation of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural human-made disasters. So there's lots of reasons why people are forced to flee, but we feel like this definition really encompasses all communities that have been displaced. We also know for many of you who work with these communities that forcibly displaced youth and families are incredibly resilient, and you'll hear that again today. And many understandably suffer the downstream effects of systemic trauma and oppression as part of their own migration journey, as well as the resettlement stressors that they may experience once they arrive. We also know, as we've talked in our previous trainings, that the journey varies widely. So we often think about the journey in these 3 stages: pre-migration, meaning life in one's home country; the migration itself, so the journey of leaving home country; and then the third stage being post-migration, or what we call resettlement. So once they've arrived into new school, new community, and now they're in your classroom. And we also know that most families have a common goal, and that is to have a better, safer life for themselves, their families, and even the loved ones that they've left behind. So when we think about that journey, we particularly think about the experiences of families once they have resettled in US or another community or country. And we have at the center identified these 4 core areas that we have found are kind of key stressors that youth and families experience, starting with resettlement, meaning the adjustment of attending to basic needs, safety, housing, food, access to schooling, access to health insurance. So the goal of resettlement is always to promote a sense of stability, to really just stabilize the home system, as well as to create agency, meaning to be able to connect families to local resources and supports, so they have mechanisms to get their initial needs met. When we think about acculturation, we're really thinking about both the process of engaging in a new culture, new language, new beliefs, new ways of being, as well as balancing the culture, the language that one has left behind, and is now trying to integrate these 2 worlds together. So the goal here we often think about is really how to facilitate intercultural exchange, meaning how to help young people balance, sometimes we say the word of like living between 2 worlds, as well as how to help them explore their own identity and cultural exploration of where do I fit in, where on the acculturation spectrum do I feel like I belong. And I think what's important when we think about acculturation is that what that looks like for each individual is different. And as we've said in the past, it's also a lifelong process for each and every person.
Wanted to let you
Let me
know.
pause because I'm in a school and you may hear intercom behind me.
For the superintendent's dinner scholarship will be cleaned up at 3:30. Anyone still wishing to buy tickets, please report to the main conference room. Buy your tickets before 3:30. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having grace for me. Many of you are probably in school buildings, so you understand. The third piece that we think about is isolation. And when we think about isolation, it's the process of, leaving family behind and loved ones often, but also coming into a community that you may not know people and you may not have people you could connect with. So the goal always here is to really nurture connection to the new community, one individually, but also create a sense of belonging. And then finally, we also know that individuals may experience traumatic stress as part of the pre-migration journey, the pre-migration experience, migration, as well as post-resettlement. So the goal always here is to think about how do we promote safety, both physical and emotional safety? How do we help young people and kids build new skills to help with regulation? And then how to restore power, knowing that trauma often removes power and individuals feel powerless. So when we think about school systems and interventions, we often think about it what we call a multi-tier system of support. And our whole last training, when we were thinking about creating welcoming environments, was attending to this tier 1 support. So thinking about what do we do as a whole school to welcome and create systems that are going to promote the health and well-being of newly arrived families. And then at tier 2, we're thinking about targeted. So we're thinking about, kids who may be at risk or need additional support. And then tier 3, we're thinking about individual supports. Today, we're going to center on classrooms. And the reason we're centering on classrooms is that if we, think about students in our schools, here's a student here in the middle, we know that the place, yes, the school as a whole is a place that kids spend a lot of time, But we know that classrooms are vital systems in kids' ecology in schools where they will spend a lot of time. I mean, and maybe one classroom or multiple classrooms throughout the day, depending on if you're in elementary, middle, or high school. But we know that ecology is so vital for how kids engage and feel supported by schools. And then on a broader system, there's the broader school community, right? So all the other systems and supports that they engage with community. And then beyond that, we think about the community as a whole, the neighborhood, the broader community they live in. And we know that across all of these systems, there are kind of three key players that are working, meaning peers that students have at school or outside of school, school staff, and that can be educators, that can be student support staff, that can be principals, administrators, but there's a huge body of adults that are there to support students. And then we also know that there are families. So much of what we talk about today will be thinking about how all three of these systems work together to support kids in the classrooms. And the way that we're going to talk about classroom and classroom ecology is that we've identified these 4 core areas that we're going to talk about each one. One is the learning environment and thinking about how do we create classroom learning environments that are supportive. 2, we're going to focus on thinking about curriculum and instruction. 3, we're going to think about how do we engage families. And 4 is thinking about how do we build student support systems in our school that are supportive of classrooms and kids. And I will now pass it to Kayla.
Okay, the first piece that we're going to talk about is the learning environment, which comprises of the classroom culture, the classroom community, and the physical space of the classroom. In terms of the classroom culture, it is defined as the values, expectations, and rituals that are communicated explicitly and implicitly that promote student physical and psychological safety, authentic expression, agency, and belonging. In order to develop a culturally informed classroom culture, it's important to consider how we can foster student experiences of the core strengths that Vanya spoke about earlier. In order to promote stability and agency, it's important to establish predictability and security through consistent and clearly communicated classroom schedules, routines, and expectations. When we think about students from this community, it is critical to recognize that this might be a student's first experience with a particular type of classroom structure, and learning and adjusting to the classroom flow can take time. We can also respond to and educate about students' needs, specifically noticing changes in a student's affect or behavior with a sense of curiosity and wanting to understand what the student is experiencing, as well as be very clear about how that student can access resources to meet their needs. For example, having a poster in the classroom with the names and pictures of school personnel associated with the resources that they may be able to provide to the student. To facilitate intercultural exchange and cultural identity exploration, teachers can encourage communication in home languages and English. They can talk about cultural similarities and differences by modeling this for students and explicitly teaching students about how to engage in these conversations. They can also affirm student identities. We have to recognize that many of the quote unquote norms in the classroom are through the lens of the dominant culture that can other or isolate students if there are not intentional ways that diversity of identity, culture, and perspective are affirmed. To nurture connection and belonging, we can cultivate mutually respectful, supportive relationships among students, teachers, and other adults in the school building, and prioritize keeping students in the learning environment. Many disciplinary practices remove students from the classroom, and when this happens, it can be really important to ask, what about the environment is making this a challenging place for the student to be? What need is the student's behavior communicating, and how can that be addressed within the classroom? To promote safety, build skills, and restore power, Teachers can provide consequences versus punishments that have a relational and an educational element. So, for example, saying to a child, instead of going outside at recess, I want you to stay with me and we can put all the books back on the shelves that you tipped on the floor, right? Putting the books back on the shelf is a natural consequence. And by the teacher engaging in that with the child, they're building a relationship where they communicate that they're supporting the child to correct their behavior. We can also foster a strengths-based environment which supports students in recognizing their own competence and worthiness, and incorporate self-regulation and coping skills in the daily routine. From a trauma-informed lens, it's important to provide opportunities for students to build skills in recognizing and coping with moments of emotional and behavioral dysregulation. And lastly, we can offer choices and leadership opportunities. For example, giving students opportunities to help out in the classroom and really give them a sense of feeling like they're contributing meaningfully to the class community. Which leads us right into the next element, which is classroom community, the sense of belonging, connection, and individual and collective care among students and teachers. Throughout our past trainings, we've been talking about 3 different pathways for nurturing connection and belonging through the lens of bonding, bridging, and linking. Within the classroom community, we want students to have the opportunity to bond with other students that share their sociocultural identity and experiences. By that, meaning connecting with peers that share the same language, culture, and ethnicity, which might look like pairing a student with a buddy, especially during unstructured times throughout the day, and having teachers invite alumni or cultural navigators to engage with students in class activities. We also want to create opportunities in the classroom for students to connect across sociocultural identities and experiences. This could be another opportunity for pairing a student with a buddy who's received some training and coaching about how to support a newcomer peer. It's also really important to establish dedicated time for community building, such as through a morning meeting, community circles, or advisory periods, where students can really engage in cultural sharing and intercultural exchange. And teachers can guide students in co-creating community agreements to foster a sense of collective care and accountability in the classroom. We also want to create opportunities for students to connect with individuals in positions of power outside of their family, such as teachers and coaches and mentors. We know specifically for this community, they may have left support systems behind, an extended family in their home country. So relationships with adults at school play a really pivotal role in supporting students with challenges, for example, responding to discrimination or addressing mental health needs, and also to connecting students with opportunities in and out of school, such as college access programs or other opportunities aligned with their interests. The classroom physical space is the design and layout of the classroom, including the arrangement of furniture, materials available, signage, and decorations. The physical space of the classroom can promote stability and agency by ensuring that materials are organized. This is another way of promoting consistency and predictability because students can learn where to reliably go for what they need. And as we discussed earlier, providing a visual guide for accessing resources in the school in both English and the student's home language can make it easier for students to know how to get their needs met. To facilitate intercultural exchange and cultural identity development, we can display classroom visuals in multiple languages, label items in English and home languages throughout the classroom, and include classroom library books and decorations that reflect students' cultures and experiences. When students look around the classroom, we want them to feel like what they see communicates who you are is valued here. To nurture connection and belonging, teachers can arrange furniture in a way that maximizes collaboration and connection, such as having students sitting in groups. They can also display the names of students in the class. Students may have a more difficult time remembering less familiar names to them, and we want to support all students in knowing each other's names, since that's really critical for identity and belonging. To promote safety, build skills, and restore power through the classroom physical space, you can create a peace space in the classroom that has comfortable seating, sensory, or calming toys and resources for emotion identification and expression. This can be a dedicated space that students can be taught to go to if they need a break. And even if it's not possible to create a separate space within the classroom, teachers can still have posters on the wall with feeling wheels or coping skills visuals, ideally in multiple languages that students can reference throughout the school day. They can also create coping kits for students to keep at their desks with fidget toys and coping cards, etc., that teachers and students can kind of co-create together, and teachers can support students in identifying what tools really work best for them. The next component of classroom ecology that we'll discuss is curriculum and instruction, which comprises of what we teach, particularly as it relates to ensuring content is culturally relevant and accessible, how we teach, particularly supporting English learners and students with educational gaps and a variety of developmental needs, and how student progress and growth is measured, particularly through a holistic lens in content and language domains. When thinking about what to teach and how to teach, particularly for this community, we're anchoring in content cultural relevance and language access. More specifically, do students see themselves reflected in the class content, and what instructional tools are needed to make that content accessible? Two social studies teachers developed a model of ethnic identity exploration in education that includes the following dimensions: making connections with students' families about ethnicity and ethnic identity, engaging students in ethnic identity discourses, meaning giving them opportunities to ask and answer questions related to ethnicity and race through class discussions, guiding students in exploration of their ethnic histories, traditions, and customs, and introducing students to social justice role models within their ethnic groups. These educators emphasize that this model allows educators to promote ethnic identity exploration while teaching subject matter content that is prescribed by state and national standards. Sweet is going to provide a link to this article in the chat if you'd like to read more about this model. From a language perspective, we're asking ourselves, do students have opportunities for both language preservation and language acquisition in the classroom? And what does it look like to position every, not just ELA or ESL, but really every teacher as a language teacher? And one instructional approach is to use translanguaging. Translanguaging, which is really a mouthful for me, describes how bilinguals and multilinguals use their full linguistic resources to make sense of and interact with the world around them. It signals an effort to move beyond language boundaries of English versus Spanish versus Arabic, etc. And this teaching method has three primary goals. One is for students to use all their language resources and skills to communicate, to comprehend, and interact in the classroom, to give students the opportunity to build on current language practices and incorporate new language practices in the academic setting, and for students to be supported in developing a bi- or multilingual identity. And since we could have a whole presentation on translanguaging, so we will add the name of a book in the chat that you can reference if you'd like to learn more. While there are many frameworks that offer a roadmap for providing culturally and linguistically informed curriculum and instruction, we will explore a couple today that have been recognized as particularly salient when working with forcibly displaced youth in schools. Historically, schools have seen the home cultures of students of color and English learners as deficits to be overcome in order to access the dominant practices. Culturally relevant pedagogies challenge this notion and propose a strengths-based approach that sees students' culture and linguistic heritage and practices as resources to explore and honor in the classroom while gaining access to dominant practices. Culturally sustaining pedagogy goes a step further to emphasize not only exploring and honoring cultural and linguistic heritages and practices, but also to really extend and deepen cultural ways of knowing and being through classroom learning. And it does this by centering language and cultural meaningfully and consistently in the classroom, by being in conversation with communities about what they want to sustain through schooling, by connecting present learning to students' histories, and by sustaining cultural and linguistic practices while providing access to the dominant culture. And in the spirit of exploring, honoring, and extending on the funds of knowledge of forcibly displaced youth and families, the Community Cultural Wealth Framework outlines different types of assets that students from this community bring into your classrooms. Aspirational capital is students and families' hopes and dreams for their future despite the barriers they've experienced. Linguistic capital is the intellectual and social skills acquired from communicating in multiple languages. Social capital is the network of support and community resources that families have. Navigational capital are the skills students and families have had to develop to navigate oppressive systems. And resistant capital is the knowledge and skills developed by taking action against inequity. And these are the strengths that you can leverage and really build on through intentional curriculum development across subject areas in your classrooms. Next slide. Yeah. Another component of culturally informed teaching, especially given the core stressors experienced by forcibly displaced youth and families, is incorporating social emotional learning within the classroom. The Castle framework highlights two ways to incorporate SEL in the classroom, one being explicit SEL, these freestanding lessons that provide explicit instruction on SEL competencies and opportunities for practice. There are many existing programs out there for different social emotional skills, and teachers may consider partnering with school-based clinicians to develop explicit SEL lessons based on the needs of your students and school community. Alternatively, SEL can be integrated into the academic instruction, which aligns well with what we've been discussing regarding culturally sustaining pedagogy and building on community cultural wealth. Integrating SEL involves fostering academic mindsets, which is the idea that students are more motivated and successful when they feel a sense of belonging, believe their ability and competence grow with effort, and feel that their work has value because they can see how it's connected to their personal aspirations. Instead of having separate lessons in the integrated approach, SEL and academic objectives are aligned and SEL and academic skills are practiced together. Here are some reflection questions to consider when thinking about how to incorporate SEL into academic instruction. I won't read through them in the interest of time, yet they're here for your reference. Now that we've considered what to teach and how to incorporate SEL, it's important to think about the instructional tools and strategies to make this accessible to students. As we discussed earlier, creating a multilingual classroom ecology and utilizing translanguaging pedagogy is really important. This might look like previewing, reviewing, summarizing a lesson in a student's home language, having students initially complete an assignment in their home language and then translate it to English, or have students read a text in English and summarize it in their home language, or vice versa. Educators can also use purposeful grouping or really intentional grouping depending on the task and learning objective. If the goal is for students to deepen content knowledge, students can be grouped with others that share their home language. Whereas if the goal is for students to learn from peers that have more content or language proficiency, students can be grouped heterogeneously. In this format, students with greater proficiency will learn from the opportunity to teach their peers, whereas students still developing proficiency will learn from peer models. And we can also differentiate class texts, class assignments, and homework assignments based on learning and language needs. For example, having some students create a labeled visual of what they learned in the science lesson, whereas other students are required to write a paragraph, whereas others are required to record an audio of them speaking about what they learned. The examples that I've provided are by no means a comprehensive list of what each of these elements can look like, but my hope is to illustrate that there are so many creative ways to differentiate instruction and utilize multiple languages in the classroom. As you know, a key component of teaching is getting feedback from students on their growth and progress. For students in this community, it's important to recognize that their previous assessment experiences may be very different from those in the US and in your classroom. For example, students may have never had to bubble in answer choices or may have only taken a memorization-based assessment. To provide clarity and reduce stress and uncertainty, it's important to explain to students the why behind the assessments that they're doing. And for the purpose of today, I won't be focusing on high stakes assessments, but rather talk about other types of ways to evaluate student progress. Portfolio, presentation, and other project-based assessments can allow students to apply learned skills to demonstrate conceptual understanding of content and also demonstrate their linguistic skills. These types of assessments can include artwork, creative writing, components in the student's home language, again, allowing them to bring their lived experience and academic learning together. And these types of projects really lend themselves well to interdisciplinary learning. Continuous or ongoing assessment can help inform the purposeful grouping that we just talked about and how to differentiate class materials and really highlight the small steps students are taking that translates to larger growth over time. And students can also self-assess, which gives them agency to identify their own goals, track their progress, and identify what support they may need and celebrate their wins. There are different ways self-assessment can be implemented at all grade levels. Given that exams are generally anxiety-inducing for anyone, yet can be especially so and especially challenging when you're still acquiring linguistic proficiency or getting used to the structure or type of questions, it's important to talk about the experience of and strategies for managing test anxiety as part of classroom learning. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Vanya.
Thank you, Kayla. As we've done, as I shared in other trainings, it feels really important that we highlight educators and school staff that are doing some of this work day to day. So I am especially excited today to introduce Kristen Russo, who's an educator at Boston National Newcomers Academy, which I shared that I've been at, and I think Kristen has done some amazing work in integrating student experience, SEL, into how she teaches day to day. So I will, let me stop sharing the screen now and transition to Kristen's slide deck to highlight how she does some of this work day to day. So give me 1 second here. I navigate too many things on my computer. There we go. All right, Kristen.
Perfect. So thank you to Vanya and her team for inviting me here today to continue to learn. I just learned a few new things and share a little bit about what we're doing at BINCA. So my name is Kristen Russo and I teach 12th grade ELA ESL at Boston International Newcomers Academy. First, I want to give you a little bit of context about our school. So Boston International Newcomers Academy, I've been teaching there for 13 years. I was in New York and San Francisco before I landed in Boston. So we're a school that teaches newly arrived immigrant youth. Typically, we're about 450 to 500 students, kind of depending on the time of year. We have a newcomers program that admits students throughout the year. We're part of Boston Public Schools, and all of our teachers are language teachers. Of course, students take math and science, but we consider ourselves language teachers. As I said, I teach seniors, so there are usually about 70 seniors per year, somewhere between 65 and about 80. We have about 70 this year. And I teach a range of English learners from twos, which are kind of like our beginning proficiency development, through FLEP students, which are students who are no longer considered ELL based on their testing. I also have students in class who have language based learning disabilities, and students who are former SLIFE, so students who have some limited or interrupted formal education and went through a SLIFE program at our school and are now seniors. So some of our students are over age, but are still in school to learn and to make their dreams come true. There are two of us. There are two senior ELA, ESL teachers, and we collaborate. So we have the autonomy to create our own curriculum as long as we meet the Massachusetts state standards. And so, you know, we have leveled classes. So you could walk into my class and see that we are analyzing a poem, and walk across the hall and see them analyzing the same poem, but maybe using different techniques and strategies. And I want to just talk a little bit about our year in senior English and how we reconceptualized our year based off of a few different things, but most notably some of the work that we've done with Vanya over time. So we have 4 units, and these units all focus on protective factors that our immigrant students have. And so our first unit centers around hope, and our essential question is, does hope matter? And that's what this presentation will be about. I'll take you in depth to that unit. Our second unit focuses on identity, and students write a senior narrative and create a digital story that they could use for their college essay, admission to college. And they're thinking about the experiences that have shaped their identity, because we know that students who have a strong sense of self and are more grounded have better outcomes. In our third unit, we look at the environment and how our environment, the social determinants of health, we look at risk and protective factors in this unit. We also look at Maslow's hierarchy. We're thinking about how our environment supports or prevents us from reaching our potential. And this is all in service of our final capstone project, which students are in the midst of right now. We have about 8 weeks of school left, so we're working on this. So students are answering the question, what supports the health and well-being of immigrant youth? And to answer that question, students can use materials from the prior units around hope, identity, having a strong sense of self, understanding our risk or protective factors, but students are also exposed to and then choose to research things that have impacted their own acculturation and health and well-being. So students, today we were talking about how faith could support their health and well-being, or having role models and representation. We've read a whole Immigrant Spotlight series. I have a student who's working on, she wants to talk about how community service has really supported her own health and well-being. So a variety of answers to that question. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of this unit. So like I said before, I started working with Vanya back in 2019, and students were really interested in studying mental health for their final capstone project. And they said, we want to study, you know, depression and anxiety. And we were thrilled that these were no longer like taboo topics, that students were open to learning about them. But when we brought this to Vanya, that students wanted to look at suicide, depression, and anxiety, she was like, whoa, great, right? Like, let's think about maybe our assets that our students have and strengths that our students have, and look at this from more of a strengths-based model. So that's why we developed kind of the curriculum the way in which we did. We had, you know, we're still teaching to our standards. We still are teaching similar literacy skills, but just our lens has shifted. So that is why we made one of our big shifts, especially for this unit. A couple of other factors that helped us shift our thinking. We read Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, and there's this framework in there she hands around collectivism and individualism. And for example, our first unit, before it was on hope, the essential question is, what drives success? And after reading a little bit and doing a little bit more research, we thought about how, you know, success is so individualistic, and so maybe shifting that a bit and moving into something different. And the protective factor we chose was hope. We also learned when I was out in California, I learned from Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade. He's a professor at SF State, and he's also created a school and is a high school teacher. And he has this theory around critical hope. It kind of reminds me of what Kayla was talking about with this leveraging like aspirational hope that our students have. But this idea of like, there's this commitment and this active struggle. It's not just like wishing and hoping that things will get better, but there's this real active approach to making what you want happen, which also just develops agency. which is part of our goal for the year. So in addition to, we want our students to become stronger and better readers, writers, thinkers, speakers, listeners, all of that. We want our students to continue to develop their sense of agency, and then also acknowledge that they are resilient, and that is one of their protective factors, and continue to build that resilience. And so the hope is that the curriculum aids in this. We launched our unit in September of 2020. So pandemic was raging. COVID, we were in remote learning. We were in Boston Public Schools. We were home for almost a full year. And so it was kind of like perfect timing to be studying hope and the reason for it. There was the murder of George Floyd, and there was a racial reckoning and fight for racial justice in this country. And so, again, the timing felt right. So this is an English and an ESL class. So we are learning English, and there's a specific, we study vocabulary in a specific way. It's explicit instruction. Our students are getting better at reading and writing. And so we are, again, doing things like previewing text and monitoring comprehension as we read our texts. Students are learning how to do additional research. They're summarizing. Depending on the final product, and I'll talk about that's looked different over the years, students, we do use the Writing Revolution. It's a text that we use as a 12th grade team to help us instruct when it comes to writing, especially with essay writing. Our students are presenting, and so they are presenting using Google Slides, and I'll show you some student work examples in a moment. And then again, we are teaching SEL components through our content, and we think this focuses, again, through integrated content on self and social awareness. I wanted to share, there are a number of different resources and core texts that we use. I have a couple of slides here that share some of these anchor texts. And I chose just quotes that students use in their final products, in our discussions as evidence. And again, this is to answer the question, does hope matter? But one of the first text that we use to launch the unit is Immigrants, We Get the Job Done. It's from the Hamilton mixtape. So we look at the lyrics, and there's an analysis that we're doing, and kids really like this because they can recognize some of the artists, and there's Spanish in the song. So that always gets them excited. The Rose That Grew from Concrete, which is what this presentation is named after. It's by Tupac Shakur as a poem. And we look at metaphor and how roses can grow in these unnatural conditions if they keep kind of striving and reaching for the dreams, and if folks acknowledge the conditions in which they are living. We read Mother to Son by Langston Hughes poem. Another metaphor, this mom is giving advice to her son and saying life hasn't been easy, but we need to keep climbing. And then another important lesson is Vanya does come in, and she gives a lesson on the science of hope. And she discusses kind of what hope is and what the benefits are, how having hope serves people and our students. And then there are some others, again, depending on the final product and what we're moving towards the final assessment. We've looked at Barack Obama's back to school speech, and that's a really great piece because he's speaking to students in language that is very accessible, and he's talking about a variety of ideas that really resonate with students, that really motivate students. We also do lessons on goal setting, SMART goal setting, and have students present vision boards. There's an example of one down below. We've watched In the Heights, which many of our Dominican students really love, and it resonates with them. And then we've looked at biographies and used those as models for one of the projects that we've done from Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, 100 Immigrant Women Who Changed the World. So there are a couple of others, but those are highlights. And then I just wanted to quickly talk about some final products. And again, this has shifted over time depending on what's happening in the world and also what our students need. And so back in 2020, the students wrote a PSA to inspire hope in the senior class. They chose an issue that was important to them and then created a 2-minute PSA. In 2021, the students did, again, we were back in school that year, but we were just coming out of COVID. Students did a slide presentation on what they learned about hope. Back in 2022, the students did an interview, this is on the bottom here, with someone who they considered, an immigrant who was hopeful and someone that they could learn from. And then what it's been the last 2 years is we needed students to do a little bit more formal essay writing because the second unit is a narrative unit. So this biography was too similar. So just in terms of the writing skills they were learning. So students now are writing an essay that has information from and evidence from the interview that they conduct with an immigrant, and then also evidence from one of the sources that we discuss as a class. So that's what it's been the last 2 years. And I think in the next slide, there are some examples of student work. So this is from this past year. One of my students, Jose, he interviewed his father, and his father's been in the country for a very long time. Jose joined him about 5 years ago. So met him after not having reunited with him after a very long time, and he really respects and honors his father, and this was a really nice way of doing that. He considers his father a fighter. That's the word he uses to describe him. And then the students chose quotes from their interview, and they included those in their native language and then translated them, have a picture of the interviewee, and then a map of where they come from. And these are hanging in our classroom. We call them our portraits of hope. The next slide, you'll see Jose presenting about his father. And then I also have on the right just an interaction, a text message with a student who is really nervous to present. It was one of the first presentations we did, and she interviewed her sister. And I was really proud that she interviewed her sister. And her message to me was, she says, thank you for giving her the opportunity to express herself. So this is that was neat that she saw her sister being able to express herself in a classroom she wasn't in. And then the next slide is just a screenshot of the introduction and one of the first paragraphs of an essay that the students wrote this year. So the introduction focused on their own experience with hope. And then the second paragraph was about the interview they did. And these last 2 slides are just, they kind of affirm what we hope the students are taking away from this unit. This is Diallo. She graduated in 2022, and the students got to these sweatshirts, these hoodies, and they got to embroider something. And I just love that she used language that we use during class. So she described herself as hopeful and resilient, and that is on her sleeve. And in the next, this is the last slide. We have a student who, this is the class of 2021. So we were home almost all year that year. And Krista's a junior right now at Lehigh University. And she wrote this, this is an excerpt from one of her essays, her freshman year. Each year at the end of the year, we started this during COVID, but we've continued it. We have a frame with all these messages that all teachers and staff can write, and we put together, and we give this to students at graduation. They're personal messages for students. And just one of they had to write in her class an essay about an object of significance to them. And I just love that she wrote here, the faith, meaning the teachers and staff, that they put in me boosts my self-esteem every day and makes me proud of who I am, accept and embrace my story, my true self, because I am smart, beautiful, and resilient. And so that's what we want our students to walk away with, feeling all of those things. So again, thank you to Vanya and her team for inviting me here today. And I encourage teachers, I'm not sure exactly who's on this call, but teachers and social workers to collaborate, partner, because a lot of this work is very possible.
Thank you, Kristen, so much. I know we only have a couple minutes with you, but I'm wondering if there's I hope today, as Kristen said, some of you may be coming as clinicians and you're wondering, like, what can I do in a classroom? But I hope you recognize that to do work with this community, such a team effort, and teachers cannot do it alone, clinicians cannot do it alone, principals cannot do it alone. So there are so many ways that we can collaborate with each other to support our students in our classrooms. And I think so much of what Kristen is sharing, I hope you can see some of the content that Caleb was, the theoretical content behind, and then Kristen highlighted the work and how that looks in our classrooms. Kristen has to run. However, if you have questions for Kristen, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will make sure to connect with Kristen and answer your questions. So thank you, Kristen, again. We feel so fortunate you were able to join us today.
Thank you.
Okay, let me transition folks as we move to, give me a second here. Let me just go down to where we paused. Okay, so we've talked about the first two elements of creating learning environments, and then we talked about developing curriculum and instruction that's reflective of our students. The third piece of today is really thinking about how do we create family and community partnership in our classrooms. And when we think about family community partnership, I really like this definition, which says that family community partnership really is shared responsibility and reciprocal process whereby school staff engage families in meaningful and culturally appropriate ways, and families take initiative to actively support their children's development and learning. Classroom teachers and schools make efforts to listen to parents and caregivers, support them, and ensure that they have the tools to be active partners in their children's school experience. In other words, right, it's this reciprocal process that happens in schools and our communities. We know that, when working with families and the importance of working with families, that all aspects of parenting are informed by culture, and cultural influences how parents take care of their children, expectations they have for their children, behaviors, rewards, punishments. And our backgrounds, cultural experiences shape, what we think is good parenting. So, and as part of that, we must have deep understanding of how then pre-migration, migration, resettlement stressors impacts families, because we know that some of our kids and youth come with families. Others may be joining families. Others may be leaving families behind, but that doesn't mean that they don't have family. And family has profound impact on day-to-day life of kids. We also know, because of these migration changes that immigrant refugee youth experience, is that there are lots of barriers to families engaging in schools. One may be educational backgrounds of parents themselves, maybe their own incomplete secondary schooling or low literacy, or even their own negative experiences of how the parents experience school in home countries, or even upon arrival, potentially negative experiences. There can often also be lots of lack of knowledge of US school system. As a refugee myself, I always say my parents, I think, came once in all of my time in schooling to my school, because they didn't necessarily know how to engage in a US education system, especially if you don't speak the same language, especially if you feel like there's no other immigrants that you can connect with at the school, especially if you never heard of parent conferences, or that you can check in at school or call the school anytime to make an appointment with the teacher. So there can be a lot of lack of knowledge of how the US education system operates. There's also logistical barriers of thinking about when parents work, lack of transportation to get to school, taking care of younger siblings. So there can be a lot of logistical barriers as well as thinking about cultural differences in how we regard school environments. It's not uncommon for families to think, to have deep, profound respect for schools and teachers, and to say, I'm entrusting my child to you, and whatever you decide, I support. So there can be sometimes difference in how we understand the role of school and family in back and forth. But we know that despite any barriers really, that caregivers and families care deeply about their child's education and really look to school as a critical pathway to a brighter future. As Kristen was saying, but for any of you that have worked with forcibly displaced communities, many kids and families will say, we are here for a better life and we are here for my child to get an education. So schools can be such an important tool to guide that process. So one model that has been developed to think about how immigrant families engage in schools is thinking about this kind of ladder process of 4 different ways of engaging. The key principles of this model is really thinking about immigrant families are heterogeneous, meaning that how each family engages, even from the same cultural community, may be very different. We know that years of residency, meaning how long families are in the country, do not necessarily determine how they enter these different stages of engagement. Caregiver involvement stages are fluid, meaning that depending on what's happening in their lives or circumstances, these stages can change. And it's important that when we think about developing individual supports, but also whole school interventions and policies and practices, that we match practices and services to these different stages. So we take into account how are we thinking about all 4 of these different stages when we are developing interventions and policies in our schools. So now we'll take a little bit of time to kind of walk through these 4 main stages. The first stage that we often talk about is what we call cultural survivors. So cultural survivors face multiple challenges, and the priority is meeting their family's basic needs. Parents in this stage may be recently arrived immigrants or refugees escaping political unrest and seeking religious freedom. They might be illiterate in their native language and need to work multiple jobs in order to maintain the basic needs of food and shelter. With their long hours of work, cultural survivors tend to have very little time, if any, to learn about U.S. school system, how to navigate it. So again, for this piece, I often think about families that are just arriving and are just trying to get grasp of this new system and this new place. So when we're thinking here, some of the kind of support strategies in schools would be attending to basic needs. And we'll talk about that in the last section as well, about how family engagement coordinators can help with this. It may be providing flexibility in multiple modes of communication with families. So, not expecting families to be able to come to parent night at 6 p.m., but maybe creating, scheduling a Zoom call. Or, I worked with the ELL teachers years ago that she scheduled parent conferences at the local mall because the local mall was across the street where most families lived. So really thinking about how we flexible in where, when, and how we connect with families and how we communicate with families. It's also important in this stage to really think about how we provide educational materials on school process engagement, to not make assumptions that they're coming from a similar school system, or to not make assumptions that even if their child has been in the U.S. education system for a little bit, that they know the system. Attendance is a huge one that I think is really important to talk about, but also thinking about, different ways to engage in school, different programming that's available for kids, responsibilities of providers, special ed laws, and so forth. And then also offering and or collaborating with agencies who may be able to offer adult learning. So families are first arriving, they may have questions like, what are there places where I can get English classes? Or how do I sign up for food stamps? Or how do I get housing support? So being able to connect with families with different agencies within the stage can be really, really vital. The second stage that this model often talks about is what we call cultural learners. So here we're thinking about cultural learners are more comfortable with the new school culture and U.S. education system. They're engaged in learning about the school, instruction, curriculum, assessment, school culture, and more, all of the stuff that Kayla and Kristen were talking about. With the help of qualified and trained interpreters and translate documents, parents communicate with schools and learn to navigate the U.S. school system. They feel more comfortable attending workshops in their native language and are likely to participate in parent-teacher conferences with language support. So here we're thinking about how do we utilize trained interpreters when communicating with families? How do we create opportunities to share educational materials and for givers to ask questions in their native language? And then how do we host cultural events and invite families in or co-create cultural events with them? So again, as we're going through these, I want you to think about who are the families in my communities, and then kind of where would I, what stages would I put them in right now? The third one that we think about is cultural connectors. So cultural connectors develop great familiarity within the school system, educational terminology and policies and practices. They share information with cultural survivors and cultural learners about programs and activities that support children and parents. Cultural connectors are able to encourage and empower cultural survivors and cultural learners to become involved in their educational and children's education. So here we're thinking about individuals that feel more comfortable in the system, and they may be inviting new parents to say, hey, I've used this resource at school. It's been really helpful to me. Let me show you now. So they're really then beginning to be the bridge for other families. Within this support strategies, these caregivers may be called upon to serve different roles within school. So thinking about, can they serve as cultural brokers? I've seen schools where they've hired parents and caregivers, whether they have children at that school, if they had children there recently, to be paraprofessionals or serve other roles in the school building. Create opportunities for caregivers to share their experience. This is so important. So thinking about, for those who have now understand and navigate the system, how can they be advocates and really support how we develop curriculum instruction, how we think about programming in schools, how we can support families in our communities. And then how we ultimately, through that, include them in delivery of school programs, new policies, and infrastructure day to day. And then finally, when we think about cultural leaders, we're really thinking about are the face and the most resounding voice of the ethnic cultural community. Parents in the stage are advocates for cultural survivors, learners, and connectors. They're able to communicate the needs of immigrant families to schools and community leaders. Participation in leadership programs and training support, their ability to sharpen their leadership skills and to learn about the roles of parent leaders in school and districts. Cultural leaders speak up for immigrant students and families' needs as a voice for voiceless families. So often these are individuals that may sit on school advisory boards. They're employed by school districts in different roles and are critical components of development and delivery of different school initiatives. So in closing, when thinking about ways that we can engage families, really here, it's important to think about how we learn about, respect, and utilize cultural values and practices regarding education. It's important for us to learn about what is the education system that the family is coming from? How is the education system similar or different to how they're engaging now in this new system? It's important to also identify specific areas of support for youth. So thinking about if a child's experiencing challenges, making sure that we provide the support and provide the right education to families who know how to engage in different systems. It's important, as we said, especially think about cultural survivors, to attend to basic needs. Often families are coming in and they have, they're just attending to just entering a new community. So it's important to meet them where we're at. If housing is their biggest priority, then let's start with housing and then build on other supports. It's also important that, depending on your role, that we advocate for needed services for our families. Not to say that schools are going to provide all these services, but really thinking about how do we connect with outside systems and connect them with different agencies so that therefore that those needs can be met. When possible, I have done many home visits in my lifetime with families. And if families are willing to welcome you, I think it can be a great way to so much connection happens around sitting together, talking, sharing tea, sharing a treat. So families are often very excited to welcome us. So, I have found home visiting to be a really helpful tool. And again, if the family is comfortable with that process. It's also important to pace the process with families. So, not expecting immediately that the family is going to come in and trust us and find us as collaborators, but really to focus on building trust and emphasizing on strengths. Families are doing the best they can within any given time. So meeting them where they are and then building from there. It's important to also figure out parents' source of pain. So what are their stressors and how we can attend to those. Being attentive to confidentiality. Depending on how they arrived or what papers they have. There can be a lot of fear around disclosure. So families can feel like, if I tell you that I'm struggling with this or this thing happened, this may impact, I may be deported. So there can be a lot of fear around sharing. So it's important to really practice confidentiality and talk about kind of do's and don'ts of our roles and what's going to happen. Invite families when they can to see their kids in school engaging in different activities, and not just invite them when kids are having a hard time. And then connect as much as you can with different cultural centers and agencies that can support families, because as we've said before, it takes a village to do this work well. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Kayla for our final component.
Thank you. In this final component, we'll talk about student support, which is the multidisciplinary team of personnel that provides specialized academic, behavioral, social, emotional, and occupational support to students and their families. In general, when we think about student support for forcibly displaced youth and families, we first need to understand some key considerations. Next slide. We want to be thinking about the pre-migration and the migration experience. What did access to schooling, basic needs, healthcare, etc., look like for this student and their family? And it's important to recognize that there is diversity in students' access to learning and behavioral supports in their home countries and during the migration experience. And given how different schooling can be from place to place, families understandably have a lack of understanding of the US school system, and some may have stigma related to accessing school-based learning and behavioral supports. For example, wondering, will this impact my child's college opportunities or employment opportunities or set them on the wrong path? We know there is a lack of consistent programming and policies for English learners across the US, which is an added challenge for both educators and families when thinking about supports. Some key considerations for academic counseling include making sure that we're educating students and families, as Vanya just described, about the US school system, supports, and resources available to them, and helping students to really develop their educational identity and defining what educational success means for them and their families. We also want to support students and families with appropriate classroom placements to promote academic and linguistic development. And we want to support high school students in understanding the credit requirements in the US and being able to obtain credit recovery, as well as think about post-high school pathways, including applying for college and financial aid, enrolling in vocational training programs, which might even start in high school for some at some schools, or employment opportunities. And really, we want to support students in understanding what they need to know and what they need to do now to set themselves up to have different options in the future. We also want to help students and families access community programming and resources. There are so many programs out there that students can benefit from, but likely they won't know about them, know that they exist, or know how to access them without our support to do so. Some key considerations for the family team include really learning about family strengths, hopes, and needs, and assessing caregiver capacity and informal and formal social support that they have. We want to think about supporting families, as Vanya described, with accessing basic needs in school or in the community. And we also want to provide space for families to ask questions or raise concerns. Schools have a really unique opportunity to build trusting bonds, and families may ask questions that they're afraid to ask elsewhere, questions related to legal matters, deportation, finances, housing, right? You've really developed a relationship with your students and their families. They may come to you to ask these difficult questions, and it's important to make sure that they know that they can. We also want to think about co-creating family advisory councils and creating opportunities for families to engage in school programming and events. It's also important to educate families about how to address and document bullying and discrimination. and to provide resources for stress management. Surveys show families in this community seek stress management resources for themselves and their children, even as young as preschoolers. Some key considerations when we think about special education services include being aware that there are issues related to both under and over identification of students from immigrant and refugee communities, which makes it challenging to balance intervening early while also giving students an opportunity to make academic and linguistic growth. And for this reason, it's really important to attend to all aspects of a child's ecology. And this is really where those intake procedures we discussed in the previous session are critically important to help think about all of the factors that may be contributing to a student's presenting concerns. And as we discussed earlier, really understanding the pre-migration and migration experience as well to really have a full and comprehensive picture of what this student and their family's experience has been and is currently. From a school system's perspective, it's important to clarify referral processes and provide students an opportunity to respond to implemented interventions, and to make sure that staff have adequate training in and appropriate measures to assess student progress and ensure that those measures are really assessing adequately how students are responding to interventions. And then after all that, we want to really critically examine whether the presenting concerns are related to a cultural and linguistic difference, to a student still acquiring the English language, to a student's gap in formal education, or due to a disability. And then provide really comprehensive explanation of special education processes, as well as what caregivers' rights are, and ensure that caregivers have access to meetings and documents in their home language. Our next training will talk a lot more about supporting students with limited or interrupted formal education experiences. So more to come on that next time. And in terms of student behavioral supports, we'll also have our last training, 2 trainings from now, will be a full training on supporting the health and well-being of forcibly displaced youth and families in schools. And so this will kind of get us started, but that will be a lot more comprehensive about this component of student support. When we think about student behavioral supports, again, we want to attend to the migration journey and core stressors and really understand how these core experiences may be impacting youth. And this, again, can come from intakes with caregivers and also from universal screenings with students themselves. Again, we want to attend to all aspects of a student's current ecology to really understand the fullness of their experience. And we want to also learn from families about and also respond to cultural idioms of distress, which are culturally rooted ways of communicating emotional suffering, ways of experiencing personal or social concerns that are culturally grounded in different communities. We can also help students reconcile differences in home and school behavioral expectations and leverage partnerships with cultural navigators in developing behavioral plans and SEL programming. We can also provide informal behavioral health supports whenever possible, given the lack of access to services in the community, especially for students and families from this population. And with that, I will turn it back to Vanya.
Thank you, Kayla. All right. So thank you all for, we would love to we have a little bit of time. So we'd love to open for a question or two from folks. So if you have a question, let us know. Please feel free to raise your hand, or I'll check in with Saweet if there's any questions in the chat. But as that's happening, I just wanted to let you know that we will be sharing the recording from today. We'll be sharing the slides post today's training. As Kayla shared, our next training is on May 7th, and it will be supporting youth with interrupted education in schools. So we'll be sharing that registration in the chat. And then also, so we will be putting in the chat our survey at the end of our training. We always have a survey to let us know how we did. And if you have any questions for us about today's training or other supports for immigrant and refugee youth. So thank you so much for joining us today. And, with the last 10 minutes that we have, feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions that you may have.